All right. Welcome back, guys. We are the Florida Hockey Bros. My name is David. I'm joined by my brother on the other side of the screen there. Today, we have a very special topic, as every episode here is special. And we're going to talk a little bit about why Southern American teams get so much hate, especially from fans of Canadian teams. That's something that was kind of obvious with the Florida Panthers and the attendance thing and the whole six fans comments that you see constantly on social media. So we'll get into that today. We have a lot of opinions there, but unfortunately, we'll start with the sad news that Johnny Goudreau and his brother Matthew passed away Thursday night. By the time you're listening to this, you'll be well aware, but we just wanted to say how devastating it is to have that happen to that family, especially considering it was his sister's wedding and all the details around it. It's just awful. Makes it even worse than just, losing your kids and your brother. On top of the fact that I'm not sure about his brother, but I know Johnny had two kids, a boy and a young daughter. So just very tragic, man. Hockey things aside, that's just sad for that to happen. I don't know if you want to say anything on that.
Yeah, no, I think it's obviously super tragic, and you just wanted to acknowledge that and the people who are impacted by that, the families, the fans, and it's a reminder that these people are human beings, right? In ways that even other conversations maybe don't remind us. But that these are people who rely on a network of people to do what they do, and then when something like this happens, they're people first, man. And we have all these conversations about hockey. We're here to have fun, to entertain. We criticize players, we criticize teams and all that, but it's hopefully with the understanding that these people are human beings, and that a tragedy like this can happen. And it just really messed up. There's a drunk driver. It's like you would figure in 2024, don't drink and drive would be a lot more sort of something that people follow, but it's still a huge problem. And just in some ways, I think makes it even more tragic that it was preventable. So
Yeah, that's another family that's ruined, right?
yeah, I know. The guy, I
Family of
think,
the
was
drunk
married
driver.
and all that. Yeah, and he's gonna go to prison for a while. So yeah, it's all of it preventable, man. You know what I'm saying? Like it's why it's incredibly tragic. So young, you know, just biking, and the cart in front like was actually trying to get out of the way. Like where I live, this is very common. People bike and you drive around them and stuff, and to have something like that. So anyway, yeah, just acknowledge it. Just want to know that yes, we're having fun. We're having this conversation about hockey, but we understand that it's not like quote unquote real life, and this is just incredibly tragic for a guy that everybody seemed to love, and he was one of the stars of the game. So yeah, for him as a brother. So yeah, just acknowledging that before we get into the silliness.
Yeah, so let's awkwardly transition into our topic. There's no other way to do it. Um, yeah, this is something that's been on our minds for a long time. I know that you're very passionate about this because there does seem to be this strange perception, this distorted perception from fans of Canadian teams, and just up north, you see it with Bruin fans and other of the original six teams. That's sort of looked down on other fans of the sport, especially the southern teams. I mean, the Hurricanes don't really get their props. Tampa really hasn't gotten their props. They're called cheaters or whatever, and the Panthers now are kind of feeling it with you saw it with Gustav Forsling being number six, ranked number six defenseman by the NHL Network, and getting a ton of backlash about that, even though no one says anything about McAvoy or anything like that, or any other guy on that list, which is kind of bizarre. But yeah, I know you have a lot to say here.
Yeah, I'm not even going to get into the force lane thing, just because, again, whether or not you think he's number six in the league, and that's what those lists are made. I mean, I thought Noah Dobson was like way too low. Like everybody has their own opinions, and the way they evaluate the game, and the way that fans and even pundits evaluate the game is very different from the way coaches do, and the way that people who actually work in the league do. Because I guarantee you, a lot of coaches would take Forsling over a lot of these players, just because if they're serious about winning in the playoffs, that's a guy that you can rely for things that many of these other guys can't really give you. Whereas you can get scoring in other ways from your team. But again, that's a separate conversation that we can have about some other time about how we evaluate players. That's one of my main topics in terms of interest. But we'll have opportunities to do that. I just also don't get like going out of your way to hate on a guy like Forsling who's been working so hard, who's a great story, waiver wire guy, who had an incredible run in the last 3 seasons. You know, his plus minus, his minutes, everything. Like, dude's excellent, whether he's six or not. So to go out of your way to shit on him just because Adam Fox wasn't in front, like he beat Adam Fox. Like Adam Fox got turned around by the Panthers. And again, I'm not trying to again shit on the guy. It's just he's an excellent player, but he gets 30, he gets about 33% of his points on the power play. If Forsling played on the power play, he would put up the same amount of points. At 5-on-5, just put it this way, at 5-on-5, Adam Fox and Forsling put up the same amount of points offensively. So, just have some perspective, man. It's just, it's just again, we just, hockey fans are dumb. I'll say that. We know that sports fans are dumb. It's one of the reasons why I like to do this. And whether you want to argue it or not, whatever, it is what it is. And that's why you see the backlash, because a lot of it comes from a place of the only word for it is ignorance. But in terms of the way that expansion teams and southern teams, or whatever you want to call it, hockey teams that feel newer get a lot of hate, and it's just not Canadian fans. There's also some established markets like Rangers fans or Detroit or whatever in the north. And then you see this across other sports too. I think it again comes from a few places that I want to break down, and I think I'll start with the idea that like I think it's curious to me how sports fans and hockey fans, and I'll talk about hockey fans specifically, don't seem to be happy about the sport growing and expanding. I guess it's because historically it's been kind of a niche sport compared to some of the other major sports in the world. It is a global sport, but it's more niche than a lot of other ones. And maybe because of that, there's been this idea that like, you kind of have to protect its purity, and like it's mostly Canadian or northern. And it's only the places that have a history with the sport that like, somehow are the ones that have the most value and should get an advantage or this and that. And, you hear it all the time in Toronto. It's like, why doesn't Toronto allow you to spend more money if it's the biggest market or whatever? And that's a model that like baseball uses and stuff. And that's a model you see in soccer. But that model makes for very top heavy sort of leagues where there's not a lot of competition and it's not fun. So I would say my first argument is that expansion teams at the end of the day, whether you think it's like the league trying to make money or whatever, yes, a lot of it is that. But all of us as sports fans can become hockey fans like we did. We didn't grow up hockey fans as kids in Cuba, but we became hockey fans like many years ago now, and sometimes longer than some of these younger fans online who are always hating. It's the expansion teams are there to promote the sport in other parts of the world or the country where you wouldn't necessarily see that happening. And soccer went through that. Other sports have gone through that. Basketball became huge in Asia. Like you've seen that happening over time. And this is just another way to now have like hockey players coming out of Florida, hockey players coming out of Texas, coming out of states that you wouldn't think would have ranks, right? It also breeds better athletes. You might have great players coming out of certain places that we already do, right? And it's funny how in the World Cup, the Soccer World Cup, we love to root for underdogs. All of a sudden Morocco, or this team that nobody ever expected, like all of a sudden goes on a run, and a lot of the world stands behind them. And like, I'm not saying that you need to root for all the teams per se, but if you stand back as a sports fan, right? If you don't have stakes in the game, if you were in the final and you lost to the Panthers, you want to hate on them. I get it, right? Like I don't have the best notion of Vegas because I lost to them, so I get that part. But that's banter. That's more like, oh, I don't like this team because they beat me or whatever. That's normal. I'm talking about more about going out of your way to like, let's say, oh, the Florida only has 6 fans or whatever. So I'll get into the fan side. I'm going to break down all the elements of the fan bases and all that. But I just want to start by saying that, like, I just don't get why people think that growing a sport, if you're doing it thoughtfully, especially if it's well run, how are you going to hit on the teams that win, bro? Like if you want to go after a franchise that's just awful and embarrasses the league year after year after year, and it doesn't spend any money like the Coyotes, they need to get rid of that owner. I get that. Get rid of the owner. What the Panthers were doing for like the first 15, 20 years, it was not great, right? So I get that. I get that history. But look how it's run now. Look at Tampa, look at Dallas, look at Nashville. Look at Carolina. Why are you going to hate on that, man? It's good for the sports to grow. So that's, I guess, my first point. It's like, it's one thing to do the banter. It's one thing to just kind of have fun or whatever. It's another thing to go out of your way to always minimize or hate or me like, oh, you're not real hockey fans or your team doesn't really matter. My first argument, it's like, it's a good thing that the sport is growing, that you have more people to banter with, and that some of these teams are winning and showing that they're actually caring. It grows the sport, and it's a sport you love. You want to see better players, better competition. Like, why wouldn't you, at the end of the day, instead of if your team isn't winning, look at your own team and why it's not winning. Stop putting other teams down. So that's my first thing. Just it's a good thing when a sport is growing.
Yeah, the fan thing is a little weird to me in that it has nothing to do with the team, whether a team wins a championship, how many fans they have, or whether it's a small market or a big market. It shouldn't matter at all. That's the first thing that I'll say about that. There were many comments during the finals from people like JD Bunkis and Sam McKee that would continually talk about that when it's totally irrelevant to what's happening. Um, you don't need a ton of fans to have success. You just have to have a team that's well run. The location of the team matters. What that state is about matters. Canada, they just care about hockey basically, so it's understandable that that's what they're going to focus on. And then the original six teams, all the northern teams with the cold, a lot of those kids, will go to skating rinks or skate outside and play hockey, and you don't get that in the south necessarily. So it's just a different culture, but it doesn't change anything. And to your point about rooting for the underdog in the World Cup and things of that nature, like it's okay to hate, to kind of hate on the opposition and all that stuff, but ultimately, and we'll record a separate video where we're going to talk about teams that we like and respect, etc. That's what it comes down to. Just respect. You just have to respect the team, and then just talk the shit that you want to talk. And then the last point about parity, and you mentioned soccer, basically not having a cap. A lot of the leagues in Europe, if you watch European soccer or football, as we do from time to time, yeah, there's not a lot of parity. In the Premier League, you have the top six teams. It's been a little different the last couple of weeks as my dog goes crazy. But you see it in La Liga with Spain. It's always Madrid and Barcelona. If you're a fan of Mallorca, you're screwed. You're never gonna win the league. You're never gonna win a championship, almost guaranteed. So it's just good for the sport. Hockey has a lot of parity, more than any other sport, I believe. It's kind of obvious. Baseball will be a close second, where almost any team, or you have 10 to 15 teams every year that could get there and win it. I mean, the Panthers could have made it a better series against Vegas if they were healthy. Like, you never know what could happen. But those are really good points, and I think now as a fan of the Panthers, you kind of see it, and it kind of hits home a bit more.
Yeah, but it's like saying, if soccer was bigger in South America or in Europe, like why are Canadian soccer team? Why do you have one? Why do you play? I shouldn't root for you. I shouldn't respect you. And if you're rooting for the Canadian soccer team, you're an idiot because you guys are stupid and lame. And there's only two of you. Same with basketball, right? And those sports are growing in Canada and are getting better in Canada. That's a good thing. It's nice to see a Canadian team with some like world class players now, right? Expanding, which you wouldn't necessarily have had 20, 30 years ago. So that's sort of the way to flip it around. It's like, yeah, I can see why hockey means so much to you culturally. No one's trying to take that away. I'm talking about the sports itself, right? The competition. It's one thing for you to like be able to play on a pond somewhere versus in Florida you have to be in a rink. But at the end of the day, to be a professional hockey player, you have to do the same things. You have to play in a rink and you have to have the same process and you have to be good at what you do, right? So my other argument, my next argument for this is like, and I've mentioned this before, it's like people kind of seem to forget that the players, the front offices, the coaches are from the same places as any other team around the league. You can hand on the fan base or whatever, but in the end, the teams are comparable. Like Kucherov is not from Tampa, like William Carson is not from Vegas, like Barkov is not from Fort Lauderdale, These are players that are trying to be great and get paid and thrive. And the more opportunities and teams they have to play in and play on, the more that you can have those kinds of stars, the more you can see those kinds of performances, right? And opportunities for guys. Otherwise, it becomes a club of only a certain group of teams or whatever. And yeah, as long as the quality is there, because again, I get it if you're saying, oh, this team is poorly run, they embarrass the league, they're not well run, the players don't enjoy it, like again, what was happening with the Coyotes was unfortunate because the fans are not at fault there. That's one thing, but to see teams succeed and then really crap on them and be like, the Panthers won a cup, it's not a real cup, or the fans, whatever, they don't care about hockey. And I'll get to the fans stuff. Those are my other points. My first two were, the expansion it's good for the league, and also the players, the coaches, everybody who's involved in these teams, and often the fans, because even Florida fans, a lot of them are not even necessarily from Florida, but like these are all people, man. These are all the same kinds of people from the same places. It's all people who have professional opportunities to play a great game. So whether it's Kachuk playing in Florida or Barkov playing in Florida versus playing in Toronto, there's no less value. It's like, well, just because in Toronto there will be bigger stars or whatever. I'm like, yeah, in a certain context, not in the context of South Florida, right? Like these guys are now become more bigger stars in Florida, which is really cool. Being a hockey star in Florida is really, really interesting and different. And as a true fan of the sport, it's nice and refreshing to be able to see that, because most of the time, a lot of the history of the sport has been up north. So it's nice to now be able to share it a little bit more. My last 3 points are getting into the history and context and psychology of, that's where I'm going to get a lot more real. But yeah, I just wanted to start with the idea that, like,
Yeah.
you're hating on the same kinds of players, the same kinds of coaches, the same kinds of people, ultimately, that deserve your respect and admiration no matter what. And again, a lot of fans do that. I just want to be fair. There are a lot of fans who respect Maurice or respect the players no matter where they play. And we're talking about the ones who tend to, show up on the threads, to tend to hate. And there's a lot of you out there who may come even in comments here to just say, yeah, Florida Panthers, who cares? Like, you guys are a joke or whatever. I'm like, you just kind of showing disrespect for the same sport that you claim to care for and be a fan of and respect. If you're only a fan of your team and not the sport itself, okay, your identity maybe is tied to your team only, but that's just bullshit, man.
Yeah, it's the way that they cope with not having the team get there or lose in the playoffs or not make the playoffs. Because at the end of the day, that there's the no state tax excuse or all this BS that you have advantage. But if you look at most championship teams, a lot of those players took pay cuts. You don't think Sidney Crosby took a pay cut? There's no state taxes in Pennsylvania. There's no state taxes in Illinois. When the Blackhawks won, the Kings won a couple of times. There's no state, there's state taxes there. I said it the other way around. But the point is that there's not like this clear advantage and then a deserving thing. Like whoever wins the cup deserves it. It's literally the hardest trophy out of all the 4 top teams in the country. So if you get there and you win it, you deserve it, man. You deserve it. You went through a lot of tough teams and goalies, and you had to grind and you had to play injured. There's so many things that go into it beyond that. Like the money thing is not an excuse when the Panthers are not stacked. The Panthers are like the 10th best team in the league when it comes to talent alone. So it's just kind of cheesy once they start doing that.
Yeah, and the other part is, so I think something that gets missed um, is the history of the sport. Like, we got a lot of hate from Oilers fans, right? It was normal. We're going back and forth. The Edmonton Oilers joined the NHL in 1972, right? Before that, they were in a different league that was trying to compete with the NHL. But what we consider the NHL, right? It was the original 6, pretty much until the 60s. It was only those teams competing against each other, and then started to expand more. And by the time it got to the 80s, when Gretzky, won with the Oilers, it was only 18 teams in the league, right? So that's also not a lot. And the Oilers have been technically an NHL team. I know there was a longer history of hockey. I'm talking about the NHL and the teams, right? Because you guys are focusing on that. Only for 11 years in the NHL when they started winning with Gretzky. The Panthers have been in the league for over 30 years now. They got their first cup at the 31st year. Not that different. Technically, you guys are an expansion team. Anybody outside of the original 6, the Penguins, all these other teams, the Oilers, the Flames, expansion teams, right? So that's all the Panthers are. That's all Nashville is. That's all Tampa is. That's all Dallas is. Like, some of them have been relocated. Like Colorado was relocated from Quebec. So at the end of the day, even if you want to be hockey purists, outside of the original 6, your teams are expansion teams. So they came in at different times in the league. Dallas relocated too in the 90s or whatever. So I think this idea that the Panthers are not a real team or whatever, like, it's been around for over 30 years. They've been to the cup final 3 times. They've had ups and downs and stuff, but it's a real team with real competition, with players from, again, the same places. And there's this idea that you're attaching the history of your sport without ignoring, that it was fewer teams back then, easier to win. So you could have these dynasties. People are used to attach their identity. There's like the Oilers winning all these cups, or the Islanders winning all these cups, or the Rangers or the Leafs back in the day, like Montreal. Like, that was a different league, man. It was a lot fewer people. In some of those cases, there weren't even that many European players. Like, it was a different league, and I'm trying to take it away from it, but that's the different context. You grew up, most fans today didn't watch any of that. They grew up with the idea of mythology, right? The Oilers, this great team, or whatever. Like, say, very different team. They didn't have a lot of competition, and I'm going to get into the cap too, because that's the cap. It's the other thing I guess ignore, and why fans get frustrated with teams and expansions. But back then, you had less competition. Some of the same teams could win. The established market had all the advantages, and they could get away with that. And they could have these dynasties that created the mythology that grew up with. Now, the reality is that today, hockey is very different. The cap is different. The way structures are different. You have more teams, more competition, harder to win. So when your team goes a long time without winning or loses to a team like Florida, if you're Edmonton or the Leafs, if you're whatever, or Tampa, then it's much easier to just spit on it and say, well, you're not a real hockey market and the fans are fake or whatever. When in reality, chances are you're an expansion team. And if you're not an expansion team and you're not winning today and you're struggling, you're the Leafs. I haven't won in like, I don't know how many years now. It could be a century before you realize it. That speaks to your team management. That has nothing. It's not the Panthers' fault. It's not Tampa's fault. They're there to be your competition, just not as easy to win when it's not 12 teams or 18 teams. But technically, again, you were an expansion team, bro. When Gretzky won, you were 11 years in the league. Before that, you were not part of the history of the NHL in terms of the official history of the NHL. So why hit on the Panthers when they're winning 30 years after being part of the same league? That doesn't make any sense. Just because you are now thinking that the Oilers have been there forever and it's Canada or whatever, the Florida has been longer in the league than your team was when Gretzky made you guys matter. So, like, it's context. Like, it's this idea that, it's not real. Well, what are you talking about? Like, why is your team more authentic than this team in the context of a professional league? So anyway, that's another thing people forget is that teams have expanded. It's been recent, and it was a very different league, a lot less competition, and the mythology you grew up with and the identity that you're attaching to the teams that you love and that you think are the real hockey teams. It's a different world. It's not. It wasn't the same. So yeah, I'll get into the cap and then at the end about the fans, but that's the other piece that pisses me off, man. It's that people like don't know the history or choose to ignore it or pretend like these hockey teams existed forever.
Yeah, yeah. Let's get into the cap and your point about the fans. The last thing I'll say about that is it's just hating. It's just hating, man. It's like if your neighborhood has two Aldis that you shop at, and then like the neighborhood next to yours, they open up two new ones there, and you're like, oh my god, why did they get an Aldi? Let them shop at Walgreens or something. It's bizarre when you really think about it. But yeah, let's go ahead and get into
Well, I just want to say I think the main disappointment and hate that where that comes from is from the fact that it's usually been passed down to you that your team is this great team and it's meant to be this great team, and therefore these other teams that are beating you now are not meant to do that. The cap is a big reason for that because people forget that back in the day when you had the dynasties and even into the early 2000s, even with Detroit, the Iserman team that everybody talks about, Iserman won when he was, that team has like 6 Hall of Famers. They could get away with that because of the cap back then. The markets that had the most money could load up. You're going to tell me that is good for a sport or that you enjoy watching 6 Hall of Famers in one team with a huge cap going against the Carolina Hurricanes that Maurice was coaching that barely had a cap, that was half of it in a finals, that's the kind of competition you want to watch. We want to mythologize the players, and they're great players. No one's trying to take away from that. But back then, you could get away with that. The Rangers did that. The Penguins did that back in the day. The Islanders did it. The Oilers did it. And they could load up with these players, with these dynasties, and create the mythology because the cap allowed you to do that. That at some point said, well, there's a lot of teams. We have to make this more competitive. Otherwise, we can't really grow the sport. Because then, as you said, the Mallorca thing, like the team can never win. Why should I be a fan? It's not even fairly set up for me to care about the fan. That's another thing you have to understand about the Panthers and about these teams. These expansion teams had to suffer under that unfair salary cap. The Panthers would not spend the same amount of money as a lot of other teams because they didn't have the revenue to be able to do that as they were growing. So is that the fans' fault? Is that the team's fault when they're new? No, that's a league that was not fair. Once they make it fair, what happens? What happens? Then you see Tampa win. You see Carolina win. You see Vegas win. You see Dallas win. You see the Panthers win. You see Nashville make it finals and be relevant, right? This is the other part that people don't want to sort of think about is that it's a good thing that it's competitive and that the cap is fair, so that you, as a huge fan, have to hold your team accountable. In the South, when your team isn't good, chances are fans are going to be outside having brunch in January instead of watching your team, because they have other things to do, because the weather is better, because they have other sports they root for. In a lot of these cities, it's America, right? So they have a lot of other things. Yes, in Canada, maybe hockey is number one. In other states, in other countries, in other places, may not always be the case. That doesn't make them less of a fan. You and I follow soccer. You and I follow a lot of other sports. We love hockey, right? It's just a different way of looking at it. But to understand that the fan base holds the team accountable. If your team isn't set up to win, if they're not trying, the fans ain't gonna show up. So what are the teams incentivized to do in Tampa, in Florida, in Carolina, in Dallas, in Nashville, in Vegas? To build a good team, to build a winner. Is the only way you can grow the sport, is the only way you can make some money, unless it's some tax write-off. You have to build a winner. So it's less even about stars. Look at Vegas, look at it. It's less about the individual star, because we have Pavel Bure, bro. Remember those 2 seasons with Bure? We're incredible. The team stunk. We got swept in the first round, and it didn't build anything. There's some memories, of those moments, but that was not the way to build a fan base. But what has happened with Cito, and even a little bit of talent before that, was to build an actual team program and to build something that can sustain it. Look at Tampa. They have gone already through 2 different generations of winners and Stanley Cup champions. Carolina might win another one after having a previous generation. And again, Vegas and all these teams, like, so don't hate on us. Don't hate on those teams. Don't hate on the Southern fans, on the expansion fans who are growing, who are learning about the sports, who are becoming passionate, because their teams are well run, because their teams are making good use of the cap, good use to the one advantage that they have, which may be the tax in some states, not every state, because they don't have all the resources that your team does have, from the history, from everything else, the fan base that shows up whether you win or lose. So hold your team accountable. If you're an Oilers fan, the fact that your team hasn't won a cup with the guys you have, it's your team's fault. It's your owner's fault. It's your front office fault. It's your coach's fault. And it's your players' fault. It's not the Panthers' fault. It's not Vegas' fault. They're better run than you right now. They have been, and they are beating you with a style that shows that this is a way to win in the sport. So this is the part that pisses me off. Why are you taking it out on us? Like, look at your team. Canadian teams, established teams, haven't won in forever because they ran it in a different way. They could load up, they could take advantage, and now they're raking the money in, laughing in your face, taking all your money for the jerseys because you show up whether you win or lose. Because I see it even in the podcast. You guys are shilling for these people and defending them, and and you can win. Well, these other teams are just better run. So how about you guys learn how to do that? Get your team to do that. Maybe don't show up for a few games, like, to hold them accountable if they're not doing what they're supposed to do. But your identity is so tied up that, like, that's your problem. Then enjoy the regular season, and when we win a cup, don't try to minimize that. Like, get out of here with that. It's just much better.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely bizarre. The way that fans look at the whole thing. And to your point, let's say, okay, let's remove the cap from hockey. Don't you think that states like Florida, Nashville, Tennessee, Dallas, states that have no state tax, don't you think that if the owner's willing to spend, they'll just get all the good players anyway? Because 20 million a year here is still better than 22 or 23 in Toronto. So it's still kind of a stupid argument. Whether there's a cap or no cap, those teams are always gonna have a little bit of an advantage, but you still need those players to take a little bit of a pay cut, because there are guys that care about what the number is, exactly what it is. Nylander was one of them. I'm sure Marner's going to be another. I'm sure Matthews is going to be another guy. Looks like Draisaitl's asking for a shitload of money. So yeah, just get guys that care and that can get you there. And to your point,
but it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. They create the cult of personality. They create the star, and then when the star wants to get paid, it's like, well, just pay them. But then you don't have the cap. It's not the tax break's fault. It's not just that. There are other ways to get around it and make that money, invest that money with players. I guarantee you, Bill Cito, if he was coaching the Canadian team, he'll find smart ways to get guys there to bring the right kind of guys and to build the right kind of team, even if you have to pay a little bit more. But you guys are your teams, not you guys, your teams and you guys as fans often prioritize the stardom, the player, the worship, right? Because you're so attached to the sport. You mythologize these guys, and then you're paying them all that money. You can build a team around it. To give, as an example, to give Draisaitl, McDavid, and Bouchard $40 million, which is probably going to end up happening with the whether the cap is going to be for the next 7 or 8 years. It's insanity. Now, you could say, well, the talent can push you through and maybe they win, maybe. But if they don't win in the next 7 or 8 years with that model, one of the reasons you can blame it is on that model because you can't pay anyone else and really build the kind of depth you need to be able to win, right? But that's a decision your front office is making. That are you willing to let one of those guys go? Are you willing to fight them for less money? No, you just want to keep them and hope that that works, right? Because of the stardom, because you just want to keep the best players. We let go of Huberdeau, right? Like at the height of his career, like we traded him and it ended up working out. It may have not worked out, but that's the way that I think fans don't want to sort of be real about their players and teams. It's like your teams are overpaying for players because sometimes players don't want to be there because of the pressure, because of the obsession, because of the fanatism, and they're like, you know what, I don't want to put up with this stuff. So yeah, it is. You can hate as much as you want, but this is what I say to end it. The model isn't changing. The cap isn't going to change. The culture of the sport isn't going to change. Hockey players are going to keep preferring coming to certain teams because there's more anonymity, because the fans are not as obsessed, because it feels more human, and it still feels supported. It still feels fun. People show up. The Panthers have been selling out for the last 3 years. It's like it still feels like there's a market. And you have fans, and you can build teams that can win, right? And you have the infrastructure and the front offices. Like all the front offices I've mentioned, all the teams I've mentioned, you could make an argument they're all really well run, and so some of the best run teams in the league. So yeah, if you're from the Rangers, or if you're from Leafs or Oilers or whatever, and you're hating on us, jokes on you because you haven't been able to win shit, and you can keep talking all you want, but good luck winning with your model. Good luck, bro. I don't see it happening. So
Yeah, that superstar thing doesn't work in the NHL. The NBA, you can have two superstars like McDavid and Draisaitl will have a couple of championships if this was the NBA. But just a different sport, man. Team construction, we talk about it all the time. But all right, I think we can wrap it up there. Unless you have anything else, we'll have another episode coming out the same day, if not the next, as this one. And yeah, we'll catch you guys on the next one. Please subscribe if you're a new listener and you got this far. Give us a thumbs up, a comment, anything. Um, will be appreciated. All right, guys. See you all next week. Peace.